Hello, everybody. Welcome to another video. It is the 13th of January, and for the first time in a while, I'm uploading during the weekday, and hence the video will be brief, focusing on the Velyka Novosilka, Andriivka, Pokrovsk, Toretsk, and Chasiv Yar fronts, especially on Chasiv Yar and Toretsk, because there are some really significant Russian advances within both cities, reaching the outskirts of Toretsk, for instance. I really do want to discuss as well the comments made by the incoming national security advisor for the Trump administration, Mike Waltz, and also some of the policy changes Zelensky is making in relation to the formation of new brigades. But I'll probably save that for the weekend. Today, we're going to zoom in and look at what's been ongoing in Velyka Novosilka, where the Russian forces have achieved some notable advances. So you can see over here, this is a continuation of last video's gains. You can see how it is directly related, this yellow polygon, to the two pincer movements that occurred earlier on in the week, where you had Russian squads advancing from the east, pushing in westwards like this, and then also from the south, pushing towards the north. And as a result, all of these other fields and whatever dugouts were left in between within these hinterlands, they had to be abandoned by the Ukrainian side. And so now there is a more stable line of contact that is very close to the highway that connects Velyka Novosilka to Hulepoli. At this point, the Russians have already cut it off physically in one location and are about to take over many additional parts of this road, which will eventually be utilized by Russian armored columns to advance in a horizontal direction towards other Ukrainian villages nearby, which would include Zelenopole, Novopil, Novosilka. These are not the main objective at the moment. Russian focus has once again shifted towards Velyka Novosilka itself. You can see that over here based on the capture of Neskuchne. You can see that the Russians advanced at least 5.1 square kilometers. This also accounts for an advance of 2.3 kilometers northwards, and this is being done along the Mokrieli River axis. If you guys recall, over time, the Russian captures of these villages running along the river became faster and faster. So you could just remember, if you go back in time, and you could click through the geolocations and see how long it took for the Russians to establish a perimeter, infiltrate into the first warehouses, and then from there clear out the entirety of Oruzhenia and Staromayorsk. It took an incredibly long period of time. And then with Makarivka, Bladatnya, the pace was reduced, but you did still have Ukrainian holdouts on either side of the river dragging out fighting, despite pressure from numerous flanks, and even in the midst of a absolute mismatch when it comes to elevation, wherein you have the Russian forces with control over ridges on either side of the river, and the Ukrainians situated right in the lowest portion of the entire battlefield, right next to the river itself. Nonetheless, you could see that the Russians have captured Neskuchne at really a record pace for this part of the front line. You could see here that on January 13th, the 5th Combined Arms Army from Army Group Vostok, they raised their flags in the northern chunk of this town. So they cleared out 400 buildings within the town. In addition, they claim that 70 members of the 110th Mechanized Brigade were destroyed. That's how it translates when I translate it from Russian. So I don't know if that means they're saying that they're all killed or if they're all killed or wounded. But they also say that 7 members of the 110th Brigade were taken POW. 110th has been moved in as a sort of stopgap to prevent the Russians from fully closing the lid on Velyka Novosilka and conducting a maneuver past Remivka to connect with the Russian gains going on in Novi Komar. And this is just a constant recurring theme with this brigade. It's always moved in during the final stages of a battle when one of the major Ukrainian holdings is on the precipice of falling or having its rear significantly threatened. And so then the 110th always acts as a sort of vanguard in order to hold the line. And once again, it's doing that right now, and it's engaged in the most heavy fighting in order to defend the Ukrainian holdings, or at the very least, drag it out for a couple more hours or days in certain areas in order to allow the Ukrainians to organize a withdrawal in a more prepared manner. It is sort of difficult in this area because, first of all, the lid around Velyka Novosilka right now is about 4 kilometers wide, which is pretty narrow, meaning that the Russians do have pretty good lines of sight both to the north, which would be east of Novi Komar, but also to the south, which would be west of Neskuchne. Both areas located on a relatively high elevation, overlooking the just clear fields that you'd have to go through to reach basically any area of reprieve, because the Ukrainian soldiers that will have to withdraw from Velyka Novosilka, they're, of course, crossing over a river, which is difficult in and of itself. They're not using any paved roads, so they're going to have to either go on foot or utilize vehicles in a way that would be, of course, less conducive for rapid movement. And they would have to go, say, 6, 7 kilometers, even 8 kilometers to reach the nearest village where they can settle in. And so it is a daunting challenge. But of course, the Ukrainians are still trying to drag out the fighting here because it is an important node of defense. And they want to buy time for the rear line that, as you said before, is about 8 kilometers away. So you already have these trenches built on the sort of vertical axis, meaning that any Russian attack from the south coming northwards, there are already preparations in those locations with trenches that were built over the past year and a half. That is true. But then a bit to the west, in the area that is between Privilny and Novosilka, there is just a lack of a unified defense line. It was not a priority for the Ukrainians to build here any unified trenches, any tank ditches, dragon's teeth, anything of the sort. And it could be partially because there aren't as many tree lines over here, but also I think it's because the Ukrainians were just expecting the Russians to come and attack vertically. But there's now this big threat of a gap forming in the lines of defense that the Ukrainians have built over here, which are pretty abundant near the border between Dnipro, Zaporozhye, and Donetsk. But in this one location, this sort of 7 kilometer line, this is an area where it's actually lacking, and that's an area where the Russians could definitely press in the future once Velyka Novosilka ends up falling. So I'm just sort of giving a warning for that before it ends up happening potentially. But over here, you can see that the Russians captured another 5.5 square kilometers directly north of Velyka Novosilka, capturing much of southern Novi Komar, reaching the Mokry Yali River. Here you can see on January 12th, the 110th Brigade, they conducted FPV drone strikes and grenade drops onto Russian soldiers, leading to Russian casualties as they were trying to cross over the river. The river itself is pretty narrow, and in some areas it is also shallow, so it's not that difficult for the Russians to advance, but they do still need to go over carefully because there is a strong Ukrainian presence on the other side, especially when it comes to drone crews. The 110th Brigade's drone element is pretty strong, and so they're now active in this area trying to stop the Russians from infiltrating the Russian, or I should say Ukrainian, rear over here. To look to the north, we're going to zoom in on the Sukhyali River. The Russians have taken over basically everything south of the river itself, and also, for the most part, all of Yantarne. You could see here on January 11th, the 10th Tank Regiment, which I have marked over here on my map, they raised their flags over the village itself, taking it over after, I would say, 3 waves of armored assaults. Were able to each time gradually get the Russians closer and closer amidst very, very heavy Ukrainian resistance from the 37th Marine Brigade. But in the end, it was understandable that eventually it would fall because it is so disconnected from the rest of the front line. The Russians have pretty close nodes for organization. And so they just had this continuous stream of attacks from the same locations, and eventually just became unbearable. So the Russians were able to get control over the relatively small settlement, meaning that now there's this just large swath of open fields that the Ukrainians are still located in to a certain degree, but there is no settlements there. It's mainly just tree lines, but not really built up with fortifications or dugouts. So Ukrainian drone crews are going to play a big role in trying to disincentivize the Russians from pushing deeper because they have the ability to push deep. They have the ability to push, say, 5 kilometers all the way to Dakhlia or to go in the direction of Ulakli, but it's not necessarily the most necessary move because the Russians are pretty close to reaching Dakhnia from the eastern direction. And you can see here they're advancing again along Zaporizhsky Road. Today and yesterday, they advanced about 2 square kilometers. You could see here January 12th, the 33rd Mechanized Brigade conducted FPV strikes onto Russian soldiers in trenches and fields east of Dakhnia. So clearly, the Russians have not stopped with their movement once they got control over the industrial zone. Very similar components of forces in terms of size are operating over here, conducting additional offensive activity westwards, but there have been some changes when it comes to the order of battle. So we mentioned this 33rd Motor Rifle Regiment moved in recently. Let's look at some of the other units here because the 5th Motor Rifle Brigade has been moved largely to fight in Vozdvizhenko. You can see your 102nd Motorized Rifle Regiment sat out a lot of the Battle of Kurakove, but now it's back to fight towards Dakhnia. And very similar with the Spetsnaz Brigade also moved in recently. So you have this rotation the Russians have conducted, which will allow them to continue with intense fighting and continue to put the Ukrainians in a sort of movement retreating towards Andriivka, all with the hope of getting control of Dakhnia and pushing along this highway to Alakli and Andriivka itself. The Russians really do not want to reduce the pressure right now. They see this as a good opportunity to close in on the town in a very short period of time. You could also see that with Shevchenko over here. There's one road that the Russians have continuously advanced through, and it's a very narrow corridor, which usually the Ukrainians thrive on. They thrive on, putting a stop to Russian assaults that are occurring in one specific point, because then they can concentrate all the resources over there, especially drones. But regardless, the Russians have been able to advance here along this same road and are very close to reaching one of the first fortifications that was built on the southeastern outskirts of Andriivka. You could see that the Russians are less than 1 kilometer away from this particular fortress, and it's one of the only ones protecting this road before then the Russians could actually achieve a lot of depth and reach a lot of Andriivka without any sort of static resistance in those locations. So it's something to keep an eye out for as we move on. You're going to see that the Russians have also been able to infiltrate into Yasnove. This was done through Ukrainka. You could see they advanced here 0.6 square kilometers, and clashes are ongoing within the village, although it is pretty small. So establishing a foothold means that it's very difficult to kick a Russian garrison out. Usually what it means is that the Russians were able to seep into the village, and then over a period of time that could be delayed due to Ukrainian armored localized counterattacks or due to drones just having a lot of activity in a certain region, that could drag out fighting. But as we've seen as a very common theme with the villages around here that have previously been taken over by the Russians, once they get a solid foothold in the village, then they're able to take over the rest of the, say, western outskirts. Looking a bit to the north, the Russians are making their approach towards Nadivka. This is being done through Novaya They're advancing again through a pretty narrow corridor, but it is preferred because it is a clearly defined route towards the target that the Russians are aiming for. And then it also allows them to utilize their armored assets on that road. So the Russians so far have captured half a square kilometer in this location, whereas the Ukrainians are still in full control of the Nadivka houses. Now to the north, the Russians have finally taken over basically all of Novosilka, maybe barring some areas near the northern parts that basically near the Solana River. But the western warehouses are now under the control of the Russians. This comes following a video from the 59th Brigade's Tank Battalion, which is very active around here. So their tank was moved from Uspanivka to the hinterlands between the two villages, and it fired towards Russian positions in the agricultural buildings, indicating Russian movement towards this chain of villages south of the Solana River, which would include Uspanivka, Novoalexandriivka, Novoserhivka, all the way to the border between Donetsk and Dnipro. Let's actually measure how far away the Russians are right now. They're about 7 kilometers away. So in earlier videos, I was talking about 7.5 kilometers away. Now it's been reduced to basically 7. And it's really up to 3 villages here that the Russians are advancing through. They're all on pre-low elevation, and they're overlooked by Russian positions in this open area, this hill. There's not many villages around here, but there's just a huge hill where the 30th Motor Rifle Brigade is operating that dominates the battlefield overlooking the Solana River. And at the same time, you have the ridge to the north, which runs from Udachnia all the way to Pokrovsk, which is now under split Russian-Ukrainian control due to recent Russian movements. So to zoom in over here, the Russians took over some of the local quarries, some of the very dense forest lines that the Ukrainians hoped to use to drag out fighting and conduct counterattacks. But they've been taken over the past 3 days. So you can see here at 6.5 square kilometers of territory captured. This is not necessary for today's video, but you can see here that according to Deep State and other Ukrainian sources, the Russians have been able to make it very, very close to the T0406 highway and to the rail line that connects to Pokrovsk. You could see at most it's an advance of 2.4 kilometers to the northwest. And as a result, even though the Russians have not physically cut off the road, it essentially makes movement impossible. It also means the Russians are very close to villages like Udachnia and Kotline, which is very important for the rear effectiveness of the Ukrainian garrison in Pokrovsk, because they need to, of course, get connected to the holdings in Dnipro. And then during the movement, sometimes they make stops, these logistics assets or reinforcements, they make stops, and usually they stop in areas like these two villages, but now they're under increased bombardment. So the Russian forces here, they're also in control of much of the ridge that runs along the rail line because it extends north and south of the rail bank itself. So now the Russians are beginning to achieve equal footing with the Ukrainians, and that means they have the opportunity to expand it and get control over an entire chunk of territory, which could, at the very least, be on parity, and in some cases, actually overlook the Ukrainian possessions, not in the center of Pokrovsk, because that's largely on high elevation, but say some of the suburbs like Troyandna, Leontovichi, Zvirove, all these areas that are on the periphery to the south or even to the north over here. Some of them are located on slightly lower elevation, and the Russians could capitalize on that to sort of turn the tables and then have their own local elevation advantages. But again, this is more so about cutting off the rear, cutting off the western supply axis for the Ukrainian garrison in Pokrovsk, which is now going to primarily shift its focus to the E50 highway, which, it supplies Ukrainians from Slovyanka. And then as you zoom out, you can see that it connects to Pavlohrad. So that's still an important route. But the Russians will have sort of unfettered access to reaching the highway if they take over Kotline, because there's no other fortifications along the way or any settlements in between the two highways. So that's something to keep in mind. In addition, you also have this road that's not really a highway, but it's a paved road that connects Dobropilia to Pokrovsk. And so it's possible to supply, say, the Ukrainians in Dobropilia from Pavlohrad and then move from Dobropilia to Pokrovsk. It just sort of extends the amount of time that it takes to move around resources. And that road will, of course, at some point be a Russian target. So all of that is unfolding as the Russians also continue to expand south of the city. So, for instance, they've taken over almost all of Pischane. The Ukrainians really succeeded in dragging out the clashes over here in the northern part of the town, but now the Russians have secured most of it, including the residential areas and parts of the warehouses. So, the 74th Motor Rifle Brigade, they raised their flag here, indicating control on January 13th. Here you can see the Russians, they just conducted this sort of spearhead maneuver, capturing half a square kilometer along the road that runs through Zvirove and then makes it eventually into Pokrovsk. So this will be the new frontier for the Russian advance as they are making their initial forays into this village. Looking a bit to the southeast, the Russians have captured much of Zelene, but there is still this gray zone in the western portion of the village. The Russians in total captured here 1.74 square kilometers. And once it is captured, in addition, once Lasivka is captured, the first perimeter line for Pokrovsk will be completely under Russian hands, meaning the focus will shift towards the second line. And in this second round of Russian movements to reach the outskirts of Pokrovsk, the front of attacks will not be as broad. It will be more focused on specific routes that are needed to actually get a foothold. So, for instance, one of them that we already saw would be through these villages over here. You'd have to see just one Russian movement along one corridor that they'd have to capture, and they wouldn't have to worry as much about the flanks that are largely open fields or some trenches, and you have really a lot of anti-tank ditches in between as well. So the Russians could sort of bypass that by fighting through the villages. And same thing with Zelene. Following the fall of Zelene, Novoukrayinka will be the natural next target. And then from there, you have control over the rail line that leads directly into Pokrovsk in addition to the E50 highway. And so that will be another region that the Russians are aiming to control. And as a result, they will, of course, create pressure on the fields, the area that's sandwiched in between those two vectors of advances, rendering it superfluous for the Ukrainians, and also the very dense and area that consists of the high rises in the city, which would be the Shakhtarsky district over here. It would also be under threat from both flanks. So that's a part of the Russian planning over here. And then finally in Lysivka, the Russians advanced from the south and captured another 0.7 square kilometers of territory. Looking at Vodvizhenka, you can see that the Russians have continued to reaffirm control over the highway over here, the T0504 highway, I believe. And there was some skepticism of my claims in earlier videos that the Russians actually cut off the road. For instance, Deep State was really not on board with it, and to a certain degree, still not. And so are a lot of Ukrainian sources. But based on geolocated footage from the past day, there are compilations from the 111th Luhansk Territorial Defense Brigade indicating that they struck Russian columns that were advancing along this road from Vozhvizhenka to the Ring Road. And they, of course, struck Russian vehicles, especially here in this location over here where you're seeing the junction of roads, but also a bit to the north in the area that actually physically cuts off the highway, which again lends further credence to the claims that were made initially a couple of days ago that the Russians were over here, and now shows that it was not just a transient movement, but that there is a permanent Russian stay over here. There's a permanent corridor that they run through and are able to make it to here without Ukrainian resistance on the ground. Of course, it comes from the air when it comes to artillery or drone crews, but not necessarily from anti-tank crews or from infantry, because those soldiers, they're either located to the east in Berezhivka, Vodiane Druhe, or in Malinivka in Novoplotavka. So you do have Russian infiltration that is very deep over here, and it has really reverberations for the area to the south, which would include this massive pocket of Ukrainian soldiers. that don't have anywhere to stay. There's not a lot of dug in trenches. There are some tree lines that they're going to try to resist in, as we know, but the lid is very, very tight. And eventually there will be some sort of front line stabilization that will allow the Russians to then be emboldened and advance even deeper along this highway, capture all of Yelizavetivka, and then their hope would be to reach the areas basically running along the highway itself to Mykolaiv and Mirnorod. So there's a lot of villages here that could be the targets for the first time after months of relative comfort due to the buffer zone in between the Toretsk River and the highway, this 5 kilometer buffer that was held for so long by the 14th and 15th National Guard brigades, also to a certain degree the 31st Brigade, but not much now, and also the 111th. And you could see that the gain that I have added in today that I didn't previously mention is in this region that includes some of the agricultural buildings. So Russian vehicles also expanded their movement into that area. We're now reaching the final stages of the Battle of Toretsk. You could see that as I zoom in over here, you could see that a lot of the recent fighting has just been the Russians clearing out the final remnants of either the western or northern outskirts. There are some clashes ongoing in the Zabalka district. This is due to the Ukrainians really hoping to maintain control over this narrow salient. You could see it over here in the red perimeter. They're trying to ensure that the Russians don't have any connectivity between their forces along the rail line in Shcherbinivka and Toretsk itself, because at that point they'll be able to unify and focus a lot of their effort and resources towards clearing out Novospassky and Leonidivka. So that's why they're holding out over here. They also don't want the Russians to then turn their attention northwards towards the road pushing up to Konstantinivka. So even though it is a very, very difficult track to go north and south, they are still maintaining control over here. And it will be a Russian goal to eventually extinguish the entirety of that salient. But for now, they're working on clearing out this western outskirts. So they captured this territory today. And to the north, they were able to control basically over the entirety of the Fomicha microdistrict, which would be the region. I think I'm going to mark it over here. I think this is correct. All of this region over here. So they've taken over this microdistrict. You could see that based on the polygon indicating in advance right next to this slag heap, which I don't know whether it's under Russian hands just yet. But you could see that also based on just Ukrainian Instagram stories of grenade drops onto Russian soldiers. It has been geolocated as of July 10th, and the Russians are operating around here. So now another focus will also be on clearing Krimsk, which is probably the strongest Ukrainian remnant in this location. It's the one that's most intact. And so the Russian forces involved with the Fomicha microdistrict will probably be redirected to fight over here against the Ukrainian forces from, say, the Safari Assault Regiment of the Liut Brigade. There's a few other units that are operating around here. Predator Police Brigade is one that's pretty notable, along with the 100th Mechanized Brigade, 2 battalions of the Separate Presidential Brigade, the 4th Battalion of the 101st Protection Brigade. And then to the west, you have the 12th Azov National Guard Brigade, really involved with a lot of the fighting over there. And of course, the 42nd Mechanized Brigade. So we're going to wait and see over the next few days whether the Russians are able to clear out the Krimsky region. But to zoom in on Chasiv Yar, this is really important because the fighting has been dragging out here for 10 months. That is just a pretty big superlative for the Ukrainians, I would say, because we were talking 10 months ago about the micro district to the east of the Donbass Canal, this region over here, and the Russians succeeded in storming it. By that point, the Ukrainians were able to shift their focus in defensive perimeter to the canal itself, which is, of course, a very large defensive structure to cross over, and the trenches on either side, the height, of course, that the Ukrainians have within the city itself, and near the fortifications to the east of the city. All of that the Ukrainians basically used to their advantage, and they also have a pretty tight-knit group of units that have not really been moved around that much, so they have a lot of experience here. They're very familiar with each other as a really cohesive unit that is operating together, and they're very familiar with the terrain, basically the ins and out of every single neighborhood and house. So when we're looking at these units, you're looking at 56 Motorized Brigade is a pretty good example of that. And there's a few battalions of it that I have explicitly mentioned over here in some drone units as well. You have 24th Mechanized Brigade moved from Toretsk in the summer to operate around here. You have the 210th Assault Regiment, Berlingo, pretty active around here. Territorial defense units are also active. And to the south, you have 5th Assault Brigade, at least partially operating around here, partial operation of the 93rd Mechanized Brigade. So it's not a massive group of forces, which is another thing that has to be mentioned. It's not like they're getting anywhere near the proportions that has recently been received by the garrison in Pokrovsk, but it is still a strong, tight-knit garrison nonetheless. when you look at recent months, the Russian forces have seen the most success when it comes to infiltrating the Novi and Zhivotnivy micro districts, which would be these areas over here. I'm going to mark them with red. I think this is Novi and this is Zhivotnovi, but I might be mixing them up. Either way, they've been able to advance through these locations, whereas the Ukrainians were able to maintain control over these houses over here in this isolated location. But as a result of the Russian advance through this initial eastern district, they were able to really get their foot in the door within Chasiv Yar's actual core. So Chasiv Yar's core includes the high-rise buildings, the hospital, the refractory plant. And for a while, the Russians were battling over here. They were able to make initial infiltrations, but were pushed back by the Ukrainians. And that's understandable because of the density of the fighting over here. It's very difficult to clear out positions. The Ukrainians made good use of localized counterattacks whenever the Russians were in an operational pause or conducting rotations. And there was, of course, wide use of drones to target the Russian side. But actually, when it comes to drones, the Russian drone crews over here are some of the most experienced that I've seen on the entire front line. There's a lot of compilation from the past week of Russian drone crews from the 200th Arctic Motor Rifle Brigade or from the, say, 98th VDV Division of Ukrainian vehicles, pickup trucks, ATVs being targeted at this western entrance to Chasiv Yar. And around January 8th, 9th, there were also significant drone strikes targeting Ukrainian holdings in the, I think it's called the Dayata district, because there are three districts in this northern chunk of Chasiv Yar. You have the Pivnishny district, which would be this eastern area, then Dayata in the middle, and then Novopivnishny to the west. So you have Russian forces, as a result of recent advances, they were able to find a weak point in the Ukrainian lines. You could see that over here with this initial geolocation from December 27th. The 18th Slavic National Guard Brigade, they tried to counteract these Russian advances, but were unable to contain the gains. In fact, the Russians capitalized on this area that clearly was lacking in Ukrainian defenses, and it's just a less concentrated area. It's a bit more broad, and it's just individual houses with gardens. It's not massive apartment buildings or factories, so it's easier to advance through. So Russian infantry on foot, they passed through and cleared out this entire chunk of the eastern parts of Pivnishny district. Also, something that I noticed is that after the initial breakthrough on December 27th, you didn't see a lot of reinforcements moved in. It was just sort of the 18th National Guard Brigade doing a lot of the work on their own. And so the Russians took advantage of that. And now they've been able to capture another 1 square kilometer, including areas near the quarry to the north of the city, but then also to the west, reaching Dayata and nearly reaching Novopivnishny. So there are some claims from the Ukrainian side of a localized counterattack capturing territory within Dayata, but that's still to be confirmed, because for now, this line of demarcation is pretty much similar to what the Ukrainians from Deep State have. And so it's going to be very critical for the Ukrainians to ensure that, first of all, the line stabilize and the Russians are not able to cut off all of the supply routes to the center of Chasiv Yar that is a bit to the south, and then to also reverse the situation at least slightly in certain locations in order to take off the pressure from much of western, or say eastern Chasiv Yar around here, and to increase the connectivity between the various defense garrisons over here. Because right now what's happening is this breakthrough is a massive threat to the connectivity. It has the threat of basically cutting off all of the roads that lead in to the high-rise apartment buildings, to the hospital, to the refractory plants. And really, that would render them superfluous over an extended period of time, and it will remove a lot of the defensive potential that those areas would have. And that's what the Russians are hoping to do. They're trying to really squeeze out the effectiveness of those possessions without assaulting them directly, because they understand the difficulty of doing so. And now, as a result of some of these initial gains, they've actually been able to make it back into the refractory plants. And it appears that the Ukrainians also withdrew from those areas. They're trying to establish a pretty solid perimeter along one single road, Parkova Road, you could say, for instance. And that includes some industrial areas, some houses. And it's supposed to be just a line that can't be broken through directly. But there's always a potential of the Russians exploiting what's going on to the north and then sort of turning southwards and putting pressure on the northern flank. That's a really big fear right now. And that's something that the Ukrainian garrison over here has to deal with, solidifying control of flanks. But then also the Ukrainian higher ups have to look at moving units to help stabilize the situation over here. And it's not helping that the 93rd and 5th Assault Brigades, even though they weren't necessarily involved with Chasiv Yar directly, recently had a lot of their elements moved away from the general Chasiv Yar front. And to finish off a bit to the north in Vasilivka, the Russians have made their first entrance into the village. You can see that over here with a capture of 1.5 square kilometers. So it is a pretty small settlement, but it runs along one road all the way to Minkivka. So that's the Russian objective over here. They want to reach the Donbass Canal in this northern part of the front line. And for both sides, really, the density of forces over here is pretty small, but it appears that the Russians have been able to achieve a positional advance. Something about the Russian garrison in Chasiv Yar is that it's been, again, very static. The only movements that were significant over the past year were for the Kursk operation, when you had a lot of forces moved away from the front line over here to engage either with Vovchansk or with Kursk. And so that removed forces from this location, but not many more were added in. But you do still have the same 98th VDV division around here, maybe also 106th to a certain degree, and 200th Arctic Motor Rifle Brigade. To the south, that's where you have the Ahmad forces. They're more prevalent around there. But that's one of the reasons why, for a lot of time, they have to take operational pauses and are not as able to conduct rotations because there isn't the same backlog of reserves around here. And so that's all out for today. Thank you all for watching. I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.